we're going to get right to it. Right here you see me dropping the blade into a container of white vinegar. It's some fresh vinegar, so it should do a pretty good job of eating through the scale and helping get rid of some of that crud from forging. And this is a couple days later. You can see that the scale's really loosened up, and you can also see there's a moth that has died and fallen into the vinegar, unfortunately for him. And this is me just kind of scrubbing the knife and getting it good and cleaned up, getting all the oils off of it, getting whatever crud that I couldn't get off with the white vinegar soak, and just gives me a good starting point for taking a look at the knife, seeing where we need to go from here. And it's looking pretty good so far. Now I'm going to move on to the heavy wire wheel on my grinder. I use this to remove some of the really deep scale and crud that I couldn't get off with the vinegar soak and the wash. I'm wearing gloves, which is probably not recommended, but this is just how I'm used to doing it. I've never had any issues, but you could definitely get your glove snagged. It seems like if I don't have gloves on, I end up getting a pretty nasty abrasion from the wire wheel on my skin at some point in time, so I'm just in the habit of doing it the way I do it, good or bad. And there it is after the wire wheel. It does a pretty good job of getting in there. And now I moved on to using the bastard file to start to clean up the profile of the blade. I want to use files where I can, just to kind of minimize how much material removal we'll have, and the grinder will definitely move a lot of material quickly, so I want to try to minimize the use of the grinder as much as possible. That's the one drawback of using a grizzly like this. It's a one speed, runs wide open, and there's just no finesse with this piece of equipment, so not recommended as far as finesse goes, but it'll get the job done if that's all you have, and it's definitely a lot cheaper than some of the variable speed alternatives. So, but yeah, I'm really having to get into the handle because there's quite a bit of hammer marks and different things I need to remove, and kind of zoomed in to show you what the finished end of it looks like versus the forged end, so you can kind of see with the lighting. I'm a pretty big fan of a file finish to an extent before hand sanding. Just something nice about being able to use a file instead of just having to grind your way to where you need to be. And I moved on to the half round file to get in the curve of the spine of the blade. I was able to use the flat file for most of it up until this point, so we're getting in there. And this is a file card. I don't know if a lot of you use these, but if you have any sort of filing to do, you need to have one of these cards to clean out the blades. They get pretty gummed up with different materials that you'll be filing, so I use a card pretty frequently. And now I'm going to the grinder just to kind of flatten things out and level things out, maybe get into some spots that I couldn't quite reach with the file. So, but the more file work I can do, the less of this I have to do. So I do all I can with the file and then move on to the grinder. And here I am starting to grind the flats on the tang where the handle material will be glued. That'll be the next major step, is to flatten and prep the tang of the knife for the scales. And here you will quickly hear the sound of my file skating on the handle. That was not intended, but the annealing that I did earlier didn't seem to quite cut it, so I ended up using a torch to reheat the handle and let it cool off slowly just to soften it a little bit. The bucket I used in the first part of this video that was full of ashes There must have been an air pocket near the handle, or the base of the handle, because it ended up just being a little too hard for the file. I probably could have fought through it and filed it, but it just wasn't worth it. And so I went ahead and went back to the torch. I just got a good thorough heat and let it cool down slowly. I ended up doing this maybe 2 or 3 times just to get it as soft as I could without having to re-anneal it. But it's definitely not worth trying to file hardened steel or anything close to hardened steel. And here's a look at the knife after some filing and grinding on the profile and having to heat the handle a little bit to soften it back down. And here I am taking the tang to the grinder to help flatten it out. And I'm just trying to go as gently as I can, and I'm using the water to cool off the handle so I can handle it. It heats up pretty quickly, so I have to keep dipping it in the water to cool it off. And you can see I look for about a 220 grit finish on the flats of the tang before we can move on to heat treat. So I'll do a little bit of grinding and then a little bit of hand sanding, and we'll be pretty close to where we need to be. And another reason why I decided to go back to the torch was if your file can't cut through the handle material, then you're really going to have a hard time drilling through. So that's definitely something to be considered. You want that handle nice and soft so you can drill through the steel, or you're going to have a heck of a time later on. For most of my grinding, I just try to use light passes, and I don't typically use fixtures or anything. It just doesn't feel natural to me. Maybe it's the grinder, maybe it's just me, but I tend to just freehand pretty much everything with it, and that's where I'm most comfortable. And there's the tang, pretty close to finished. And then I've moved on to hand sanding just to get to the grit finish that I want, and to just kind of make sure that everything looks like it's good and flat and there's no surprises later on in the process. This is a fixture I purchased from Edward Braun. If you like the look of it, this was for large bowies. Now this hand sanding, that little sanding block that you just saw, was actually a steel planer blade that I just ground the cutting edge off of it, and I use that for a lot of my really hard hand sanding. It's just a piece of steel with some masking tape on it. Doesn't sound very ergonomic, but I've never really had a problem as far as how comfortable it feels to me, and it's about as durable as it could possibly be. So basically I have a piece of steel with sandpaper wrapped around it, and I'm using WD-40 as a lubricant to just cut through and sand everything relatively flat into a decent finish. But for sanding blocks, you can get really creative. But this was something I made early on in my knife making days, and it really works pretty well. And I have found very few things that feel like they could replace it. So I would highly recommend, if you have access to some worn out planer blade, make use of it and try making a little sanding block of your own, or several. I have a box full of them. And we're sanding and sanding and sanding. And that's pretty much the finish we're going for, just to give a nice flat surface for the scales to be glued up to. And now we're moving on to our preliminary bevel grinding, and this is a little file guide that I bought from USA Knife Makers or someone, maybe an Uncle Al, I can't remember, it's been a few years ago. But this makes a huge difference in your initial grinding and getting your plunge lines lined up. This might be probably one of the only fixtures or jigs that I use. Not that I shouldn't use them, but I just haven't built very many. And I usually start out with a hollow grind just to kind of get my initial bevels kind of where I want them to be. It feels natural to me to start that way. and then I'll move on to flat grinding it on the platen right in front of me. As far as grinding technique, I try to keep my elbows close to my body for stability, and it makes a huge difference. And I'm no brilliant knife grinder by any means, but I typically can get a blade where I want it, and then I can finish it with hand sanding. And that's what you'll see here. It's not going to be, you know, machine finish quality, but it'll be close enough to where I can take it to the bench and sand on it for a little while and get it exactly where I want it to be. And I think I'm using a fresh 60 grit ceramic belt for this. I think that was what I was using at the time. I like a nice sharp belt for grinding bevels specifically. It makes a huge difference in how clean you can get the bevel before having the hand sand. And try not to go too, try not to grind so deep that I don't have any edge left for heat treat. I like to leave a 1/16 or so of an inch thickness on the cutting edge before heat treat. And I can typically hand sand my way to nearly a cutting edge. And here we've moved on to the flat platen. And that is where we will get for today. Like I said, I've got some hand sanding to do, but it'll work for now. Thanks for watching.